You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Abram Kivelevich, and I hope you enjoy this episode. The Projectionist Has Semicha. I'm here with Yitzchak Kolakowski, and I think Chava is also here tonight. She had such a fun time last week as we talked about Mike Lee and Cinema Verite. Tonight, Yitzchak, I'm going to let you start because I know you're fresh off an experience which for you was electrifying, right?
All right. Well, we went Motzei Shabbos. There's a little movie theater about an hour from where we live, and the name of the town is Rosendale, New York. For the past few months, one Motzei Shabbos a month, monster movies, which of course is
That's your love language.
Yeah, that's our happy place. This month, they showed from 1951, The Thing from Another World. And I'd seen this movie first when I was a young kid, probably 7 or 8 years old, and it was on AMC. They would show back when AMC still showed old movies instead of new TV shows. They would show, once or twice a week, some kind of monster movie, and they would be hosted by Bob Dorian, and I always enjoyed the host segments, and sometimes he'd be at some movie palace and talk about the history of all those movies and so forth, and the preservation of the film on the nitrate stock and so forth. And I remember taping this and keeping the tape of The Thing. The Thing from Another World is the full title, but everyone just calls it The Thing. And the subsequent remakes all just call it The Thing. And I'd never seen any of the remakes. I know those were very popular, although at the time they weren't. But the first remake certainly.
Yes, John Carpenter's version. I mean, John Carpenter was an auteur. Most of what he did, definitely, he pushed horror into a whole different realm.
On the phone, Cleve.
I think Carpenter thought, Yitzchak, that he now had the special effects expertise to really scare you, and he actually changed the nature of the monster. But let's talk about the original.
What Carpenter did was he followed the original book.
Right. In the original book, this monster is sort of a shapeshifter that can somehow take on the aspects of whoever approaches it, but which wasn't really able to be done convincingly in 1951. What they were able to do there. Yitzchak, you take a look at the original movie poster for The Thing. It creeps, it crawls, it strikes without warning. Now, the like all movie posters, that's not really what this thing is about, right? The thing is about.
That's what, now watching this movie, I guess I'm technically an adult. It strikes me. 40. Yeah, so, yeah. I just turned 39. It strikes me as a totally different movie because when I was watching it as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, it was, I just want to see the monster, and like, when are we going to get to see the monster? And then you don't really see the monster, even the one scene at the end where you do see him, it's pretty dark. There's a lot of smoke and it's like, well, what's the point of this movie? All right. So they.
Yep. So let's Yitzchak, let's not bury the lead for a second. The monster is appearing in an Arctic, near an Arctic base, where the group of scientists who are experimenting there or doing research there have discovered that a spacecraft has landed, seemingly from another world. And in that frozen environment, right, there is contained there the pilot or whoever it was, the passenger on the spacecraft. That's the thing from another world.
Right.
And they have to go out and retrieve this thing. And the drama is really what's going on between these actors and actresses who are part of this ice station Zebra that's out there, right?
Right. And like I said, as an adult, I'm appreciating that drama, the the acting, the storytelling, much more than I could have appreciated as a child. I see it's actually, there's a lot of really adult themes that are going on there, that are kind of, rather shocking, for the time. But it was Howard Hawks, who I don't think made any other monster movies or horror movies in his whole repertoire. I mean,
technically the producer, right? Technically the producer.
He was the producer of this film, but he had directed many other films, and probably my favorite of his filmography was His Girl Friday.
Yeah, I love it.
And there are some aspects of His Girl Friday, I think, the kind of the repartee between the male lead and the female lead, where they're talking over each other, and that's one thing. Hawks
talk really fast.
Yeah. This one I don't.
A lot of alliteration.
And there's also a lot of jokes. There's a lot of in-jokes, even references to Hawks' other films. There's one part where one of the soldiers said, "Oh, I saw Gary Cooper do this in Sergeant Preston," and that was one of Hawks' films. And so in this movie,
and part of the conversation that's going on is to give you a sense that these are real people that are out there, and they're dealing with what could be a life or death situation. And I think part of the argument that's going on there is reflected in another classic, incredible science fiction film, which of course is Ridley Scott's Alien, which is, we need to find this thing. We need to have this thing. We need to bring it in, right? We need it for what? For what purpose? For scientific experimentation, to maybe use as a weapon. Who knows? What can we harness? Even though clearly this is dangerous to us, right? So you do have a similar idea here about.
You have and probably my favorite character in the movie is the scientist character, who, is probably the least realistic looking person there. Meaning everybody else just looks like a regular person. There's nothing, so special about the look of, they look all pretty unassuming, normal, just regular people. And then you have this scientist who, he looks like a professor. He looks like a scientist. He has a very stylized beard, and the way he dresses and everything. He presents himself, the way he talks, the way he he's the one who's, probably the hammiest, character there. Is different than anybody else, who are just, normal people living their lives, soldiers and workers and the secretary and this and that. And so it's, but somehow that character, who's the least realistic, somehow he really, I find the resonance in him, because he's
discovers that this alien, and this was part of Charles Lederer and maybe Ben Hecht's invention, isn't like is not as carbon based or organic or like a mammal, but he's actually some sort of vegetable life, and because of that, it's so fascinating to the Dr. Carrington. That's why he wants to keep it alive, right?
Yeah, and it touches on what would later be touched on in another movie about plant life emulating human life, was the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Alien Plant Life, right. Where again it's because he doesn't have the same animal drives that humans have, being part of the animal kingdom, that attracts him. That he said, this being must be pure intellect without any emotion, and so therefore it's something that it can teach mankind, how to be sublime, but really it's not sublime. It's just the opposite. It's quite
and like Alien, again, it lives to absorb. It lives to, right, because this is the way it lives, is by killing everyone, right? That's what it's about.
Yeah, I mean, in this sort of, it's just living off the blood,
right? Right. It needs to kill them, for somehow its blood gets into its vegetable system. We talked off pod, Yitzchak, that unlike most monster flicks, where who knows who was underneath all that, rubber stuff, this film might have been one of the first films that featured that television mainstay that I remember from my youth as the symbol of nobility and goodness, Marshall Dillon himself, James Arness.
Right.
Who, because of how big he was, I think the reason why they used him is because he was just a tall, muscular person that I guess the costume worked well with him.
Yeah, it was makeup. It wasn't any kind of I mean, obviously it's still a costume, but I'm saying it wasn't like, and I think the fact that he receives a credit in the movie is quite interesting because it wasn't traditional to credit any monsters. I know Rico Browning told us, he had to pay admission to go see himself play the creature from the Black Lagoon, and when he played the monster a second and third time, he begged them to give him a credit, and they said, no, we don't credit monsters in costumes like that. Here, it's more similar to something like the Frankenstein monster, where it's more makeup than a rubber suit. And I guess that's the nafkamina, that someone, if they're in a gorilla suit or a creature suit, they don't deserve a credit. But if their own actual facial features and so forth are being transformed through makeup like a Frankenstein or a werewolf, I guess those types of monsters did get credit. I guess that's the way it must have worked at that time in the.
Whatever. This seems to be getting from there. Arness went on to bigger and better things. It's a very interesting thing for our listeners, perhaps. They could probably find it on YouTube. The very first episode of Gunsmoke, which of course was a very famous radio serial that had the voice of William Conrad, who didn't look anything like James Arness. William Conrad was the fellow with the incredible deep baritone voice. Of course, he was also on Rocky and Bullwinkle. And he was later, of course, the fat detective of Cannon. You remember in the 70s when there was a craze in television of all different types of weird detectives. James Franciscus as the blind, the Longstreet. Buddy Epson as the old Barnaby Jones, and William Conrad as the fat Cannon. So Conrad was the voice on the radio, but when they decided to turn it into a television series, which became one of the longest running television series of all time, John Wayne introduced the first episode on TV, and he says, I want to tell you that here's the star, James Arness. And of course, John Wayne was about 6'3", and James Arness had a good 4 inches on John Wayne. And he said, he's bigger than me. And you can see when James Arness steps in there, the height and the power of who he was. Clearly in the thing, like he said, all he had to do was basically run around and attack people.
I mean, again, you don't see him very much. He comes behind you see him, they open the door and he grabs and you see him, he attacks some dogs, the dogs rip off his arm and the arm grows back. They set him on fire and he jumps out the window, and apparently that was a stunt double.
Oh, he was Rasputin.
Yeah. And then in the end, finally, he walks down this hallway and you're able to see something more, and they zap him with electricity, and that's how they finally kill him off. And when they do that, because they realize it's a vegetable, and so you cook a vegetable, he shrinks down. So actually what they did was, and there are pictures of James Arness next to this little person, they had a little person in the same type of makeup, after, representing this, you don't see the shrink. It cuts away and cuts back. And by the time it cuts back, they shrunk it down. And you see this little person, taking the form. Arness hated this movie. He really resented the fact that the monster was some kind of a carrot, even though it didn't look as much like a carrot, like it conquered the world. That really actually looked like the shape of a carrot. This looked more like a Frankenstein monster, but he felt that it was beneath his dignity, and he always would refuse to talk about this movie when he was asked in interviews. He did another monster movie 3 years later, was Them, where he was a police officer. Another great, more highbrow, not a B movie. Both of these are highbrow movies, but like you said, Charles Lederer writing, and most likely Ben Hess was somewhere behind.
Dimitri Tompkin score. I mean, you have a lot of prestigious things in this film that I don't think most people realize.
And that's also seeing it on a big screen. It wasn't a huge screen; it was a smaller theater, but we sat right up front and seeing it. It was different than even I'd seen it as an adult on a DVD, and it's quite a different experience to be sitting in the theater watching this and following the story more carefully, not looking at your phone and this and that. And
no, you're right. It's an argument for the old way of watching films, which is going to become rarer and rarer, especially whether there's COVID out there or not. People enjoy and the gigantic screens they have at home, especially when they can stop the film and rewind it, like geeks like us end up doing quite a bit.
I saw on Facebook where I learned about this and people were discussing about this showing. One person's like, well, why should I go out and go to the movie theater and watch this when I just bought the movie on DVD at Walmart? And I answered, I said, well, I went, and this was an experience. I have it on DVD, and it's a much different experience sitting in the theater with close to 100 other people. And that was something that amazed me, because I've gone out to theaters where it's been empty. I know there was a showing of King Kong just as all the pandemic lockdowns were starting, just before everything shut down. I saw King Kong on the big screen, and the theater was empty, and that's my favorite movie. And here, another RKO movie, and here we see. I was just amazed to see all different ages. There were teenagers there, older people, other children. I wasn't the only one who brought my kids out to see see this, and it was really quite a even though I didn't really.
I think this really takes us, Yitzchak, to a whole nother topic about how movie watching has changed and what films meant for a community before television. I think we've talked about it in previous programs, and what that movie experience is. When we talk about the influences of Thing, not only on the remake, but I think one of the best episodes of the X-Files is also pretty much a remake of The Thing, where somehow Mulder and Scully are somehow out there in some Arctic research area. I think it's called ICE. I think and there's also some sort of alien that is invading and killing everybody. So it's quite a homage to.
There were so many great scenes in this movie. I know one of my neighbors who was Nifter a few years ago was one of Misfallen or Shul. This was his favorite movie, The Thing, and I was always thinking, well, why? What that? I wouldn't say that's my favorite, even my favorite 50s sci-fi, but seeing it, I have an appreciation. And there's certain scenes like when they, they're not sure, is this an airplane or is this, what is it? Is it from outer space? Is it from the Russians? Is it one of ours? Is it one of theirs? And then when they all gather around to, see what is the shape of this thing, and they realize it's a circle, they're like, they're so excited. We got one. It's a flying saucer. And another, colorful character.
In films in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Yitzchak, act as very interesting and quick ways of doing exposition, right? You're at a newspaper. Oh, the news is just coming in. Oh, this is what it's about, right? They're able to move things along because of their attitude, because of what they're about. They're here to tell the story. So I think it having a reporter up there is a way for the reporter to ask the scientist what's going on. The reporter is able to see what the public would say. So having that character is really, in a way,
he doesn't do that in this movie. That's the type of thing you would see in other movies, and he does not do that in this movie. He is, he's there, almost as a type of a foil, but also he's just in the way, and he's also disappointed because they're told the story should not get out, but the story kind of gets out anyway. And so he's expecting to be the one who's breaking this big story, and he doesn't get that. And here he is right in the midst of it. And there's funny parts where they open the door and he just wants to get all he really wants to do is get the pictures. That's all he cares about is getting pictures. And at one point when they open the door and it's too quick, he's not able to get the picture. So then they're like, so the one soldier is like, well, you want me to open the door again? He's like, no.
People see it as a metaphor for the distrust of communism. But now that's not really such a heavy issue, the film can really just be enjoyed as really a classic, as you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, the monster is almost secondary, and even the suspense is secondary. It's the storytelling. It captures, and like, because again, you don't see the monster, and the one story I remember that Bob Dorian told on AMC was that they had James Arness made up in the makeup for the monster, and he had to drive over to the studio, and I guess someone was driving and he was in the passenger seat, and there was two lanes on each side, and they stopped at the red light, and the woman looked over to the side and saw James Arness in this makeup, and apparently she fainted from seeing this creature, which again to us, I compared to Carpenter's The Thing, it's nothing special, nothing. It doesn't look hokey, doesn't look stupid, but doesn't look scary to me or anything. But I guess in those days, a little bit different,
From a imagined monster who terrorized and took the blood out of its victims and was left alive in a way that could wreak havoc, to another monster who, in this film, was left alive and did wreak havoc. And that's Adolf Hitler. What I'm speaking about is 1941's Manhunt, directed by that incredible emigre from Germany, the Jewish, although he was raised Catholic, his mother was a Jew, and that's part of the reason he escaped from Germany. We're talking, of course, about Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang, who made the silent classics like Metropolis and M. Here he is with a film that is, I think, overlooked. Most people see this film as a propaganda film, but it's based on a magazine story that later was a novel by someone called Gregory Household. Talk about an interesting name for a writer. Gregory Household wrote a treatment in a magazine, which he eventually turned into a book called Rogue Male. And this was about a English big gamesman, a hunter, who has decided he's going to go after this terrible dictator, and he's going to penetrate where this dictator lived. Now, when Household wrote the book, he was afraid of backlash from Germany. But when Fritz Lang and his writers got a hold of this, they earmarked Hitler right away. And there's you can see that they actually are they go to a simulated version of where Hitler's chalet was in the mountains. And Walter Pidgeon, in his best role, I mean, we talked about Walter Pidgeon in Forbidden Planet, and I've seen him in other films. I generally consider him wooden and boring. He is fabulous in this film. There's a manic aspect of Pidgeon, but there's also a stalwart heroism of him, and also, in a way, a symbol of a certain wrong-headedness of what they considered manly English bravado. Here he was considered a world famous hunter, and he decided he was going to go after the biggest game of all, Hitler. And the film starts with what could have been the assassination of this man. And Fritz Lang uses newsreel footage expertly melded into the film, because he's looking at him with his telescopic sights on his hunter rifle. And, you're watching it and you're saying, this is like Inglourious Bastards. This is like, yes, kill him, right? Everything will be over. but he doesn't have Pigeon as the hunter. As the hunter doesn't have ammunition. He just wanted to show that he could do it. Then he decides to put a bullet into the rifle, and at that minute, as he steadies his scope and has Hitler Yamach Shemo in his sights, he is attacked by a German guard and is brought to the chalet, where he is beaten and tortured by, as you know, Yitzchak, my favorite villain, one of the great English actors who I don't think ever played it wrong, George Sanders. George Sanders plays a German, and again, he knew this film, the Germans speak German. The Nazis all speak in German. But of course, this is an Anglophile. This is a German who loves England. This is a German, this colonel, this Nazi colonel, Keith Smith, seems to maybe have had an English mother. They don't really explain why. When he switches from German to English, he talks like George Sanders. And he is blood-curdling in his villainy because he knows exactly who this fellow is. And what he wants is not his death. He actually appreciates this fellow. He appreciates Thorndyke, is what his name is, the hunter. He appreciates him. He actually has followed his exploits. But he says he wants him to sign a document that he was an agent from the English to assassinate Hitler, and they'll let him go. They'll send him back to England free, but it'll be in the world stage that England wanted to assassinate an elected dictator who became dictator of Germany. And of course, he refuses to do that. In fact, he denies that he wanted to kill Hitler. He says he wanted to prove that he could do it. It was an exercise in what he calls of being able to achieve. He wasn't going to kill him. It was a sport. He wanted to show to prove to himself that he could break into the most heavily guarded fortress in the world and go after the most dangerous game that there is, man, and the most dangerous human being on the planet. A fascinating idea. And if Household came up with it, or Fritz Lang came up with it, that's itself worth it, just to hear about this idea. Now, of course, Daryl Zanuck and the production crew over there, the people that were behind the film, did not want to show the Nazis actually torturing Walter Pigeon. So you see it off screen and you can hear him being beaten. You can see him afterwards. His face is bloodied. And again, why the Nazis just don't kill him and put a bullet in his head, I don't know. But for propaganda purposes, they decide that they are going to throw him off the cliff as if either he committed suicide or something, and that they could still get something out of it, that he was trying to kill the Fuhrer, and he just when he failed, he decided to kill himself. Anyway, it turns out that when they throw him over the cliff, his knapsack saves him, and he's able to escape using his wiles. And part of what the film indicates is that Thorndyke, and this is why it's called Manhunt, because they're after him, is not just a hunter who knows how to stalk game, but he knows how to survive. Every hunter can become the hunted. And I think that's part of the theme of the film. He becomes the hunted, although he was the greatest hunter and he knew how to go after the most dangerous beast. Now he knows how to survive. He knows how to camouflage himself. He knows how to hide. And he is helped in his escape to get back to England by a young boy played by Roddy McDowall. Roddy McDowall, this was the first film that he made after he escaped from England. You know, Roddy McDowall, of course, was in London when the Blitz occurred, and he was able to be taken out of England and came to the United States. And of course, had a wonderful career as a child actor who becomes a stowaway on a Danish ship, and he's the cabin boy, is from England. And of course, he's going to help him survive and hide him. When Thorndyke arrives in England, the Nazis are on his trail. In fact, the Nazis have picked up his passport and his jacket, and they've enclosed and given the passport to one of their assassins. And their assassin is played by the most American actor you could think about, John Carradine. John Carradine plays as we know, was of course the Reverend in The Grapes of Wrath in the same year. John Carradine, this tall, gaunt, ghostly figure, plays this assassin who they call Mr. Jones in the credits, and he is the one who realizes that he's got to hunt and lead the hunt against and to find Thorndyke, to find Walter Pidgeon. And he, again, Fritz Lang, using the techniques that made him such a master of silent film, the cinematography, the way he shoots Carradine in long shots, the menace that he has, the menace that he projects is palpable. Suffice to say that Pidgeon is running around London. The Nazis are after him. Eventually, Keith Smith, Sanders' villainous role, is using all diplomatic options. And part of what the film shows you is that the Germans, right before the war, had a tremendous amount of influence in England. And that even though Thorndyke is actually the brother of one of the lords and should be protected, will be extradited because of the appeasement policy that England had with Germany at the time. And also that not only is John Carradine there, but there are policemen who are actually secret Nazis and a number of other people running around, meaning there's all these Nazi cells operating freely in England in the time right before the war. And this, of course, is a criticism of that whole attitude. It shows, again, that the leaders of the country, even though they realized that they were dealing with a madman, someone who was very open about his intentions, were wanting to keep this person in power or not taking the aggressive steps that were necessary. So the film, although it was made in 1941 in order, Fritz Lang and others, it was made in order to encourage America to break its isolationist stance and to join the war effort. It's also a critique of what was many people's positions pre the war, and it exposes really the banality of evil that was inherent in the British diplomats. And I think this is a very telling and important point that Fritz Lang is making. Now, of course, the same way Roddy McDowall, this little waif, is able to help him survive, the other person who helps him survive is a whore, a call girl played by Joan Bennett. Joan Bennett, of course, is a famous American actress. Yitzchak, of course, you know her as I believe the mistress of Dark. And Joan Bennett, of course, had a very long career in television and the movies. And in the 1930s and 40s, she usually played some sort of if not a femme fatale, but some sort of I would say a spirit of Eros. And in this film, she is able to help him survive. She hides him. She brings him over to his brother. And what many people feel is the weakest part of the film, she has tremendous romantic feelings for him, even though, because he's a real gentleman. She's been dealing with a lot of phony gentlemen. She's been dealing with a lot of wealthy people who have only visited her for what she's able to provide. And this is a very noble person who has the best of England about him. And she's going to be like the whore with a heart of gold. She's going to help him. She doesn't want any of his money. and she somehow follows him and tries to. And there's a great scene where in the underground, which Fritz Lang and his production crew were able to design a pretty wonderful facsimile of what it was like in the underground in London, and what it was like when somebody is being chased on a subway train. It was very, very well done, including a very scary situation where he's being hunted in the subway tracks itself, which is somewhat similar to what Fritz Lang did in M. I don't want to spoil too much from it, but I will tell you that the end of the film has a standoff finally between Pigeon and Sanders, and it happens in a place that Thorndike Pigeon has developed a place where he's literally holed up, and the game of wits that ensues between them, the dialogue, the way that at the end of the film, and this is not really much of a spoiler, that Thorndike basically admits to Keith Smith that he did want to kill Hitler. And even though he told himself he didn't, when he did put that bullet in, he really thought that he would kill him, and that he recognized, even though he didn't want to say it, just like England didn't want to say it, that this man was terrible. This man was the root of evil. This man would bring out all the worst tendencies in human beings. And that's part of the reason why he refuses to save his life, to sign the confession. It is in many ways, I think we have a tendency to look at films that have an obvious intent, and we try to dismiss their artistic value. Yes, this was meant to push Americans to love what England were doing, to recognize what Hitler was about, and to join the war effort. But because of that, people see it as was moved by his own hatred and by what Goebbels and others had done to eviscerate his career, doesn't really diminish what he was trying, the statements he was trying to make. Now, people give a lot more credence to one of Fritz Lang's other films, which is called Fury, which has to do, of course, with mob violence. And as I mentioned this, I think in a discussion with you earlier, that was a film with Spencer Tracy, where he is accused of being a murderer, and he's killed by a mob, but not really killed because he escapes, and then he wants to get his revenge. So that film, which also has a very much a pedagogic purpose, for some reason, is not as dismissed. Where I think this film is actually its superior film in terms of cinematography. I think as much as I love Spencer Tracy in that role, I think that Manhunt really, in a way, can take us back to a place right before the war, and also really contemplate something incredible, which is, if Hitler would have been assassinated, was he the lightning rod? Would there have been someone to take his place? It I think lends itself to a fascinating discussion. I don't know, again, if we compare the Thing to Hitler, right? But the point is, they were able, using your science, Yitzchak, to be able to reduce him to a little vegetable that they were going to cook on the frying pan. Would that bullet have changed things? Or was it possible that once Hitler had stirred up, perhaps there would have been Goering, there would have been others that would have taken up the mantle and would have run with it? Maybe the concentration camps wouldn't have been as vicious. Maybe there wouldn't have been this complete, total desire to annihilate the Jews. But I think we as rabbis and we as Jews have to think about things in this way. This monster that arose, this icon, that really, and again, in 1941, we didn't even know the extent and so seeing it again, to me was very powerful. It really stirred in myself the idea of, had he been assassinated? And of course, there were actual Allied plans to assassinate Hitler afterwards. Clearly, they thought that if they cut the head off, calmer people would rule. We know that Martin Bormann, even among the Germans, among the Nazis themselves, was behind the plot when they realized how the war was going to end in defeat. Martin Bormann and others wanted to assassinate Hitler, and of course they were discovered. But like I said, I think it's worthwhile just for the beauty of Lang's vision of how he gives you this dark and terrible place, this dark and terrible London underground. And no clay pigeon indeed is Walter. So that's it, my friends. We hope that
he wasn't pigeonholed.
He was that pigeonhole. Yes. All right. Watch your step on the way out, my friends. We'll catch you next time. Take care, everybody. Be well. Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.